So, in terms of the second half of this lecture here, I'd like to talk about something which is a hot button issue today, which will continue to be a hot button issue, and has been a hot button issue for most of our nation's history, right? Something that we've talked about very extensively for the past 2 weeks. This notion of immigration, right? This notion of human migrations. How do humans move around throughout the planet, and what type of implications does migration have? So the questions we deal with are, why do humans migrate? Who makes up today's migrants, right? Or who makes up today's immigrants? How long has migration been in human societies, and how is immigration affecting the U.S. today? So is anti-immigration kind of new, or this kind of notion that we need to keep immigrants from coming into the country, whether legally or illegally? This is actually not a new sentiment in amongst the U.S. populace, nor are kind of government officials, right? Scapegoating is a common practice governments use to blame social problems or social ills on the other. If we look at our own history in the 1850s, we blame the Chinese for the opioid crisis, which later led to those immigration laws which heavily restricted and in some cases banned Chinese individuals from coming to the country. In the 1890s, we blamed the Irish for alcoholism. In the 1920s, we blamed Latinos for the emergence of marijuana and cocaine. So in essence, what we're really looking at is this kind of notion of Americans versus everybody else in terms of kind of uh, these kind of immigration policy as well as social policies. So this is featuring a political cartoon that came from essentially the New York Times, actually, that shows kind of the Irish whiskey and the German lager beer stealing the ballot box. And what this was really saying is that, during this time, these immigrants had become so populous in New York City that they were essentially stealing the elections or getting their own officials elected simply through their voting numbers. And this is a more recent political satire cartoon, kind of looking at the perceived message that the GOP puts out for illegal immigrants, right? So it's this whole notion of get out, you illegal job stealing, tax waste, and drug smuggling, brown invaders, right? But what I want us to pay attention to, because this is very satirically laden, but I want to pay attention to the three main things that people point out as being why we should be anti-immigration: the loss of jobs, the wasting of tax money or the leeching of the tax system, and this whole notion of crime, right? And we're going to kind of debunk each of these myths regarding immigrants in the U.S. But before we go myth busting, let's look at a little bit of why humans migrate, right? We, of course, migrate in search of new food sources, right? We migrate following game animals originally out of Africa. We can migrate to find a better climate. We can migrate to avoid conflict as well as to establish new trade relationships. Migrations, in essence, are very, very old, right? Movements of human populations begin with one of our direct ancestors, a species called Homo erectus, right? Homo erectus was likely following game animals into the Middle East at a very slow pace, likely increasing their home range by a kilometer or two per year. So it's not like all of a sudden Homo erectus just decided that one day they were going to leave Africa, right? They were most likely following migratory patterns of the animals in which they were eating. Over time, migration is increasing exponentially. If we look at China, for example, within China alone, there are an estimated 230 million rural to urban migrant workers, right? So it's kind of noting this difference between outside versus inside migration, right? Only 3% of migrants move outside of their home country. 97% of migrants are rural to urban migration, which is people from within their own country who move away from a rural area and into an urban area in search of economic opportunity. So rural to urban migration is the movement of people from the countryside to the city, and this causes three things to happen. You have, of course, urban growth. Towns and cities begin expanding, covering greater areas of land. You have the process of urbanization, which is an increasing proportion of people living in towns and cities versus rural areas. And you have the arrival of megacities, right, which are cities whose population is over 10 million people, right? People are attracted to urban areas because they think that they will have greater economic opportunities, but for many, life is better, but some also end up in poverty as well in the cities, right? So they exchange one form of poverty for another. When examining this, human migrations or movements, we have this concept of pushes and pulls, right? These are the forces that spur the migration from the country of origin and draw migrants to a particular country, right? This applies to both immigration within and between countries. If we look at push factors or rural push factors, to be specific, these are the negative factors that make people migrate from villages into cities, right, from rural areas into urban areas. We have a lack of investment from the governments in rural areas, so no money, right? Rural areas have a lack of services like hospitals, transportation, and schools. Rural areas have high birth rates, though, thus, those places are sometimes overpopulated in developing countries. There are more jobs in the cities and people have better salaries than they do in the rural areas. Sometimes crops are destroyed by natural disasters and people have to move to other places or move into urban areas to accommodate for that. Most of the farmers in developing countries don't have their own lands or don't own their own lands, right? Thus, they are poor. So if we look at some other push factors, of course, we have population pressure, poor infrastructure, inadequate job offers, bad educational chances, poor healthcare access, ecological problems, including natural disasters, as well as social compulsions. And social compulsions are a very fancy way of saying that there's a lot of crime, right? If we look at pull factors, pulling people, we have improvement in the standard of living, better health care and availability of services, varied employment opportunities as well as higher wages, quality of education, no social compulsions or lower crime rates, and better future prospects. Other push factors include warfare and civil strifes are a major factor contributing to migration in multiple regions of the world. Currently, refugees come out of war-torn areas in Eastern Europe as well as Central Africa. We also have this notion of bridges versus barriers, right? Migration, we know, is not an easy process. We have bridges, which are programs or factors which assist in migration, and then you have barriers, which are programs that are designed to prevent migration of people. If we look at some of the bridges that kind of promote immigration and human migration, of course, we have employment recruitment centers that will be recruiting individuals in other countries. You have family networks, right? Kinship networks work quite a bit, right? You have family that are in a different country and you may migrate over to be with them. You have open border policies, which are actually not common at all. And then, of course, you have government sponsored specific bridge programs as well. In terms of barriers, we may have closed borders like we have here in the United States, or mostly closed borders. Education level can act as a barrier. You may be denied entry into a country because you don't have the appropriate level of education. Language, of course, is a primary barrier, not knowing the language of the country you are attempting to migrate to, as well as government interference, right? Whether it be your native government interfering to try and keep you within the country, or your new kind of host country government getting involved. One kind of pervasive pattern we do see in human migration today with the advent of kind of modern economic systems is this notion of remittance, right, which is the act of sending money and resources back to the family in your home country, right? So you migrate, you go to a new country, in most cases usually to Western Europe or the United States, you establish, your new life there essentially, but you're still connected to your home country via this kind of economic connection. This actually reflects the true nature of immigration, right? A lot of people are not leaving simply to go and set up a new life somewhere else. They're leaving to go and seek better economic opportunities for their families that still exist in their home country, right? This reflects something that we call cumulative causation, that in many instances, migration has come to become expected within these cultures, right? So the cumulative cause, right? All of these kind of economic factors, all of these kind of bridges, these pushes and pulls, these barriers, right? Everything works towards this creation of a cultural notion in the third world and in the developing world that the best economic chance that an individual or a young person has is to immigrate to a first world country. This is just showing you kind of the numbers of displaced people that occurred during kind of periods of conflict, right? With, of course, being the largest that we've seen post Second World War between 1939 and 1945. Kind of right after World War II, we start to see a lot of migration or displacement. We also have India and the partition of 1947, as well as the Bangladeshi War in 1971. We have the Syrian War, which actually this graph is not entirely accurate because the numbers for the Syrian War grow on a daily basis, right? We also have something called chain migration, which occurs, which is essentially a very contentious issue in the United States. It involves the movement of people facilitated by the support networks of family or friends who have already migrated. So, in essence, what they're doing is they're kind of using their ability within, being already accepted members of their new country or in their new culture to kind of get to help people migrate over, right? In many instances, chain migration is associated with remittances or the transfer of money back to the country of origin to support family networks there as well. So, in terms of the types of immigrants that we see today, we have labor immigrants, which may be legal or illegal. These immigrants fill low wage positions that are generally not filled by native persons, right? It's usually part of these guest worker programs, like that of the video that you're going to watch here in a second. And I want you to kind of pay attention to this video. It shows you kind of one of the big criticisms that we see against immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, is that they come here and they take our jobs, right? Oh, they take our jobs. But the issue really is that's not really an accurate reflection of what the reality is. In a lot of cases, these individuals are filling positions in industries and in jobs that would struggle to fill those positions otherwise with Native American workers. Another type of immigrant that we see in the modern immigrant landscape here is professional immigrants. These are highly trained individuals who migrate to fill a middle class economic position or job offering in the new country, right? Many professional organizations, such as hospitals, will set up recruitment centers overseas, much like the infographic that we're going to see here in the next slide. The unfortunate side effect of this is something that we refer to as brain drain. This is essentially taking all of the college educated individuals from a foreign country and enticing them to move to a kind of usually a westernized or a more advanced country. And the reasoning for that is, because they're kind of, they want to take their they want to utilize their intellectual abilities as well as their ideas and things like that. But the negative side effect of that is that they leave their native country, and their native country and their society there no longer has access to their technologies, their innovations, their potential inventions, things like that, right? So essentially, they're not able to participate in using their knowledge and using their abilities as a highly educated or a highly trained professional to better the infrastructure of their native country, right? They end up going and working for the infrastructure of a larger, more wealthy country. So, in essence, brain drain is the immigration of highly trained and knowledgeable professionals out of their native countries, right? This causes economic strife and a lack of development in the native country. And low to middle income jobs are then outsourced from the U.S., things like customer service jobs, so that they can create room for these kind of high income or high technical skill jobs, which are kept within the U.S. And our last type of immigrant, of course, is we have the entrepreneurial immigrant, which is one who migrates to a new country to conduct trade or establish a business. This applies to small scale businesses as well as large scale corporations. So this slide, as well as the following slides, will kind of show you some of the kind of trends in business that we see in terms of how immigrants participate in our own business system within here in the United States. And then when we also talk about human movements and migrations, we also look at refugees, right? These are people who are displaced by conflict, economic depression, or famine. And this type of migration, of course, is always forced. And this includes internally displaced people as well. So it's not that they're fleeing their own country and to another as a refugee, right? This also includes people who are moving in between, parts of their own country, fleeing strife, economic depression, or famine. If we look at this kind of involuntary migration, the causes could be unfavorable social conditions like persecution or civil wars, or unfavorable environmental conditions like droughts or floods or famine, right? The effects of involuntary migration is that refugees cause economic strain in their host countries. There becomes developed these poorly equipped refugee camps, and some of these refugee camps could be in the millions of people living there, and we're going to look at quite a few really, really large refugee camps. Are kind of shocking to see in terms of the size of them. They could lead to unrest, right? Some refugees will refuse to go home after the conflict is resolved and they're able to go back. There could be racial conflicts that occur in the host country. Many refugees also depend on aid from developed countries. And they could turn to being locked up in barricaded detention camps like the U.S. is doing to people on the southern border. The refugees who return could also face integration problems in their native country. So these numbers are invariably different today, but this is from a kind of UN Council report from 2017 that shows an average of about 65.6 forcibly displaced people million people displaced worldwide, about 22.5 million refugees worldwide, about 10 million stateless people, and in terms of in 2016, the amount of refugees among all of these that were resettled to other countries was 189,300, right? So you may be wondering why we have these huge refugee camps. Well, this is why. The ability of host countries to resettle refugees within their own cultural and economic and government system is there's resistance that's put up by those hosting cultures, as well as there's a fair degree of difficulty, right? So not a whole lot of refugees have actually been comfortably resettled. This is showing you a refugee camp that's in Dunkirk, France, the same place that was the site of the famous World War I battle. But in essence, what we see here is this camp just has a few thousand inhabitants, but they can get much larger than this. This is showing you a refugee camp that's in Lesbos, Greece. It's actually, which is an island off the coast of Greece. And so this is just showing you kind of just another kind of variation of a refugee camp here. This one, I believe, numbers in a few thousand as well. So this is a place called Al-Zatri in Jordan, has about 200,000 individuals living within this refugee camp. So you can see these refugee camps get much, 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 much larger, right? So this is kind of a very pervasive problem in terms of how our modern societies operate in terms of forcibly displaced people versus the programs and the abilities to resettle those people into new host countries. In Bangladesh, India, here's a refugee camp of over 600,000 individuals. In the Yida region in the South Sudan, you can actually see a refugee camp that hosts 1.1 million people. It's so large that it actually expands beyond the visible horizon in the photo. Some of the camps are so large in terms of population and size that they have to be photographed from aerial photographs from very high up, like the one in Dagaheli, Kenya, which houses about 2 million displaced individuals. And you may be asking yourself, why do we have so many forcibly displaced people? Climate change plays a small role in it. Some areas are becoming unsuitable for farming, and starvation occurs. But a large degree of it is because of conflict in different parts of the world, right? And we can see if we want to really diminish that level of conflict, if we want to really kind of have a global effect on the level of violence that occurs, or organized violence in terms of state-sponsored violence, really we have to get at these arms manufacturers. And unfortunately in the United States, we have to come to grips with a very real reality, a very stark reality, that we are the largest arms manufacturer and largest arms dealer on the face of the earth. For a government that purports to have an army that fights for quote unquote the forces of good or acts as a force of good across the globe, this is also saying this out of one side of the mouth, while on the other side of the mouth selling all of the guns to all of these places that are in these massive conflicts, right? So if we were really concerned about global peace, about using our economic and military might for the right of good, we wouldn't be making arm deals with places like Saudi Arabia. We wouldn't be exporting arms, period. We would be going around the world confiscating arms and trying to prevent warfare and confiscating implements of death, not selling them. So if we look at migration today, it is spurred globally by economic forces. In general, people leave the underdeveloped world and migrate to the developed world. People migrate for access to healthcare, jobs, and education. And in these host countries, illegal immigrants suffer most as they pay taxes yet are denied access to basic amenities that their taxes pay for. We're going to look at a few examples here. So if we look at a case study, comes from an ethnography called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. It was written by an anthropologist called Seth Holmes, who lived amongst the indigenous farmers in Oaxaca, Mexico. And when farming failed in Oaxaca, he traveled with those migrants across the U.S. border illegally, was caught twice, and really, what this kind of highlights throughout the entire ethnography is the struggles that immigrants face within their host and native countries. These farmers from Oaxaca were leaving because they didn't have the economic opportunity needed to sustain their families. So they left Oaxaca, and the closest place they can go to look for work was the United States. So they traveled across the border illegally, worked and lived as illegal immigrants in these tiny tin shacks on the outskirts of the farm, and were denied access to basic welfare services, denied access to healthcare access, and they were denied, more importantly, denied access to the same worker safety conditions that are mandated by our own laws. That if the people working in those farms were Americans, those farms would be fined and cited for their kind of practices, which expose these illegal immigrants to pesticides and other things, right? And what the ethnography really does is it highlights the fact that these people live and operate within our country. They pay taxes, and they don't receive any benefits from those taxes that they pay, right? That's one of the biggest myths amongst immigration, that illegal immigrants do not pay taxes. Well, if they have a job, if they are working at an institution, at a farm, at a restaurant, at any business, that business is paying payroll taxes for them. And in essence, what they're doing is what happens, and in the ethnography, he uses the farm as an example. On this farm, every illegal immigrant had a fake social security card that was assigned to them by the managers of the farm. And the managers of the farm would then, in turn, file those tax returns for those illegal immigrants to the government for them and collect the tax return. So not only were those immigrants paying their taxes via payroll taxes and income taxes coming out of their weekly checks, they weren't even getting their tax returns because all of the farm owners had all of the social security numbers and were the ones who prepared and filed the tax returns. So Holmes's conclusions were that immigrants generally feel forced to leave their native country, right? When he did interviews with multiple immigrants, that was the general consensus, that they didn't really want to go and have to illegally travel to the U.S. for work. They prefer to stay home and have economic opportunity in their home country. Immigrants routinely pay taxes, hold jobs that may be otherwise unfulfilled, and contribute to local economies, right? Immigrants are also routinely denied access to medical care, public schooling, and state welfare services, all of which are paid for by their taxes. And the agricultural workers that are illegal immigrants are routinely exposed to dangerous agrochemicals without the ability to report these farms for their unscrupulous and clearly EPA violation practices. So immigration or perceptions on immigration are cultural or culturally laden, right? Native-born people can harbor certain ideas regarding the input of immigrant communities, right? We have this whole concept of nativism, right, which is preferring the native community or, creating systems would prefer the native community over those of immigrants coming in. And what this relates back to is something in sociology they call scapegoating, right? So in the late 1900s or late 1800s, for example, the Irish in the U.S. were scapegoated as the cause for alcoholism and domestic violence, right? It wasn't an American problem. It was these Irish people coming in, bringing alcoholism into the country. Today, economic hardship and lack of social welfare in the United States is blamed on illegal immigrants from Central America. In essence, we have the two primary complaints. We don't have welfare because the immigrants are taking it all, and we don't have jobs because the immigrants are taking them all, when the reality of the situation is actually much more complex and paints a much different picture than simply people coming in and stealing jobs or living off of the great kind of big teat of the federal government, right? So for anyone who kind of hears these, or for any of you that may hear these kind of anecdotal arguments against immigration out there in your daily lives, I urge you to remember two things. One, that jobs or job availability switches quite a bit, right? And in a lot of instances, these jobs that immigrants are filling are jobs that would normally go unfilled by Native American people, right? Because they pay too little and the conditions are too rough, like you saw in the video from this lecture. And the second thing I want you to remember is that there is no welfare system for which the illegal immigrants are suckling off of or draining. The welfare system, starting in the 1980s, has been systematically dismantled in the United States over the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. And you can look at that history of how different changes in welfare funding have occurred over time. So the resulting lack of welfare in the United States today is not the result of immigration or any result of people taking. It's the result of our system changing its policies to cut the budgets of those different welfare programs. We saw that play out in real life with the argument over CHIP, the Children's Health Care Insurance Program that was being proposed that was going to be cut out of the budget last year, right? So there was a big fight over whether or not that was going to stay, funded by the U.S. government. So that's how welfare changes, by changes in institutional funding, not by illegal immigrants sucking all the resources away. So the next couple of slides will look at some myths versus facts in terms of how immigrants actually participate in our system here in the United States. So the myth is that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. Well, in 2010, undocumented immigrants were recorded paying about $10.6 billion in taxes. So one of the myths is that immigrants negatively impact the U.S. economy. If we look at just legal immigrants, right, the facts or the numbers don't speak to that reality, right? Immigrants raise economic output by roughly 21.5 billion per year. And one of the kind of issues that we have in terms of passing a comprehensive reform, or one of the arguments we see, is that if we were to include everyone or be more inclusive in terms of our citizenship and participation in our system, that it would inevitably bankrupt our Social Security system. Well, the actual fact is that when we run the numbers, the Social Security Trust Fund would actually increase by around $600 billion a year over the next 25 years, right? And at $4.6 trillion over the next 75 years. So in essence, it would make our Social Security system solvent in perpetuum. It would be able to operate freely and without much constraint, and we'd never have to worry about running out of Social Security benefits for anyone if we were to incorporate all of the kind of immigrants and illegal immigrants that were in the country into the tax-paying system. So if we look at another case study in immigration, we see this comes out of actually a cultural anthropology textbook. So this is the kind of case study involving this country, Mali, which is an example of something we call country-to-country migration within Africa. Mali, or the country of Mali in Africa, is a hub for trade today as it was in antiquity. So the Togatala region in Mali is actually known for producing traders due to inadequate agricultural produce. So in essence, what they're doing is they're taking this international economic trade and they're producing specialists that work within it because they don't have any other slots to fill economically within their own country, right? So Malians sometimes today are treated as second-class citizens in larger African cities that they may migrate to, but that's essentially because Mali itself has no other output other than service-based industries, which is actually a lot like the United States here. In immigration today, we also have this concept of transnationalism, which is the practice of maintaining social, political, and religious and active participation in one's native country while living across borders, right? So, in essence, this is kind of it goes along with remittance, right? You're still participating in your home country, but you're also living in a foreign country, right? You can also think about this in terms of what it is to have dual citizenship. We also have this thing called return migration, or sometimes called a yo-yo migration, which is when migrants return to their country of origin, sometimes within the same generation. And this is part of transnationalism, or the notion that you're still participating in your native country, right? An example of this would be Japanese immigrants migrated to Central and South America to establish businesses in the early 1900s, but when there were mass labor shortages in Japan that occurred in the 1990s, they ended up returning, or their children ended up returning to go back and help build the infrastructure of Japan back up. We also have these things within larger countries called diaspora communities, right? These are when whole communities of foreign people living in close geographic association with one another in their new country, right? So if we look at an example, New York has several diaspora communities, including a Lebanese community or Lebanese neighborhood, an Irish neighborhood, a Japanese neighborhood, a Chinese neighborhood, and an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, right? If you want an example closer to home, we have the Tibetan and Nepalese diaspora community that's off of Talmadge Road in Akron, right? So it's really actually not that far away from our own campus. So to wrap everything up in terms of our talk on migration here, remember humans are a highly mobile species. Immigration can be a contentious issue and has many myths that surround it, and is very culturally laden. Immigrants are humans too. I know, shocking, right? People are driven by the same reasons, whether immigrating or staying in their native land. Most immigration or migration today is forced, whether migration for economic or military conflict. Be sure to kind of review the case studies that we've presented so far in this particular lecture, and also be sure to review kind of that connection between the social construction of race and how it's related to intelligence testing, how it's related into reification of immaterial scientific objects or statistical anomalies or essentially statistical artifacts. Be sure to review how we have taken this concept of, or how we've moved from being scientists who were measuring bodies and trying to prove, the existence of different races via bodily measurements, going to these innate characteristics or these kind of immaterial characteristics like intelligence or aggressiveness or things like that. Always be ever present, or kind of look at how race is perpetuated and how it's portrayed as a culturally laden system within our society, right? And know that there may not be a biological foundation for race in terms of biology, but there is a very distinct social foundation for race that is very real in our society today, and something that we need to acknowledge, and something that we need to work towards, kind of moving towards a society where racism is a thing of the past. But unfortunately today we are still not there, right? We still have some time that we have to get through. We still have processes, we still have equality or notions of equality that need to come to fruition before we can really say that racism is dead. Yes, we've moved scientific, you're right. It's basically one of the saddest things from an old science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov. One of the saddest things about society today is that we gather knowledge at a faster rate than we gather wisdom, right? And that goes to show we've gone the full arc with science. We've moved to the point where we have recognized that our early scientific studies were wrong. We've recognized that intelligence testing is wrong on a base consensus. We've recognized that there's no real biological foundation for race, but we need to catch up in terms of wisdom. We need to have our cultural and our social systems reflect that reality, and today we are simply just not there yet.